some critics of the TV show Mythbusters claim that the show misrepresents the scientific process. For example, experiments are sometimes conducted only once and without adequate controls, but then these results are generalized to make definitive claims rather than repeating the experiment and using statistical analysis as a scientist would to figure out what is really true. So ironically, a show that is meant to educate people about science may instead be giving them the opposite impression of how science works. But similar criticisms have been made of Veritasium. For example, when Destin and I performed our experiments to show that the water swirls the opposite way in the northern and southern hemispheres, we only showed doing it once, even though we each did it 3 or 4 times in our own hemisphere. And I guess that brings forth the question, should we change what we're doing? I mean, should Mythbusters and Veritasium really show the repetitive nature of science and use statistical results as evidence for our claims? Well, my answer is no. But to understand why, we first have to dig into something called the helping experiment. And this was performed in New York in the 1960s, and the way it went was individual participants were placed in isolated booths where they could speak to 5 other participants through an intercom, but only one mic was live at a time. And these participants were meant to speak in turns for 2 minutes each about their lives, any problems they were having, and it would just go in rounds. Now, what the participants didn't know was that one of them was actually an actor who was reading a script prepared for him by the experimenters, and he went first in the first round. He talked about the problems he was having adjusting to life in New York City, and particularly the difficulty that he gets seizures, particularly when stressed. And so everyone else had their turn, and then it came back around to this actor again. Now this time when he was speaking, he became more and more incoherent as he was talking. He said that he could feel a seizure coming on, and he made choking noises. He asked for help from the other participants. He said he felt like he was dying, and then he continued to get more and more distressed until his mic went off. And the point of the experiment was to see how many of the participants would help. I mean, if you were one of the other participants, do you think you would have left your booth and gone to see if he was okay? In total, about 13 participants took part in this experiment, and the number that helped before his mic was turned off was just 4. Now, while this might sound a little bit disappointing about the state of human helpfulness, you got to keep in mind that there were other people listening to the same distress call, and that may have diffused the responsibility that individuals would feel. This is something known as the bystander effect. Now, what's interesting about this experiment, from my point of view, is not how it confirms the bystander effect, but in how people view the results. For example, they fail to change their opinion of themselves or others after learning about this experiment. For example, have you changed your opinion about how likely you would be to help in this situation, now that you know that only 30% of people did in that situation? Well, there was a follow-up study conducted where students were shown 2 videos of individual participants who were purported to be from the original study. And they had already learned about the study, and then they were asked at the end of watching those 2 videos, which were pretty uninformative, just showed that these people were good, decent, ordinary people. The students were asked, how likely do you think it was that those 2 particular participants helped? And overwhelmingly, students felt that those 2 participants would have helped, even though they knew that statistically only 30% did. So, in fact, it would have just been a better guess to say they probably didn't. They didn't seem to really internalize those general results as pertaining to the particular. They just kind of assumed it excluded ordinary, good, decent people. Now, is there a way to get people to really understand how the world works? Well, they did another follow-up study where they talked about the experiment, they described the experiment, but they didn't give the results. And then they showed those 2 participant videos, again, not mentioning anything about the experiment, but just showing that these are 2 decent, ordinary people. And then they told the students that those 2 people did not help in the experiment. And they asked the students to guess what proportion of people did help. And now, in this case, when they were going from those particular examples of ordinary, nice people who didn't help, they were much better at generalizing to the overall result, to the statistical result. In fact, they got it basically right. And I think this highlights for us that our brains are much better at working with individual stories and things in detail than they are with statistical results. And that is why I think if you're Mythbusters or Veritasium, it's better to communicate science, to tell the story, to show the experiment really once in a dramatic way, rather than 3 or 4 times where each new iteration, well, each repetition just confirms the original result that you were talking about. But if you're actually doing the science, if you're actually trying to establish scientific fact, then of course you need the repetition and the statistical analysis. So I think it really does come down to what your objectives are. But with this conclusion, I think this opens up 2 big potential pitfalls. One is that people without scientific evidence can make crafty stories that catch on and quickly become what people feel is the truth. And the other pitfall is scientists who have strong scientific evidence, who have clear statistical results, and yet they can't communicate them to people because they don't have a great story. So an example of the first pitfall is the recent spread of this rumor that the outbreak of a birth defect, microcephaly, in South America was actually caused by a larvicide made by Monsanto. That story caught on like wildfire, and you can see why, because it's got this clear villain that everyone loves to hate in Monsanto, and it's got a really causal story that someone is doing something bad to the water, and it's this poison that we're poisoning ourselves, and it's a very emotive, clear story. While the other story is, well, it's a little bit more statistical, that there is some kind of connection, which is the scientific consensus that the Zika virus carried by these mosquitoes is causing the microcephaly. And there are strong indications that that really is what's happening. And if you look at the claims about the larvicide, they really don't hold much weight. I mean, the larvicide is so weak that you could drink 1,000 liters of it a day, 1,000 liters of the water treated with this larvicide and have no adverse effects. Or this larvicide has been used in dog and cat pet collars. So really, you know, there isn't strong evidence for the larvicide connection. In fact, there is no connection between the larvicide and Monsanto at all. But I think the story took hold because it had such a strong narrative. On the other hand, you have things like climate change, which have very strong statistical evidence to back them up, large-scale results over the globe, and yet one cold, snowy winter is so much more visceral and meaningful to individual people than this thing which feels, you know, completely data-based. And it just depends on how much you trust data, I guess. As scientists, we love data, and we feel like if we're trying to communicate to someone, we're trying to convince someone of something, all we need to do is show more data. But what experiments demonstrate to us with statistical certainty is that stories work much better. Normally I do these walk and talk style videos on my second channel, To Veritasium, but I imagine that some of you might not know that that exists, so I thought I'd put one of these here on One Veritasium. Plus, this one has a fair amount of data and, you know, experimental stuff in it, so I figured that could be interesting for you as well. So if you want to check out the second channel, then go to To Veritasium. I'll put a card or something for it up here.